He asks my father immediately to see the child. He sees the child. My father says everything will be all right. And then he says, I need to talk to the Rebbe. He had an open door by the Rebbe. He came out, he told the father of the child, from whom I heard it a few times, that the Rebbe once told my father that when you come to a situation where medicine cannot do anything, you should pass a verdict, a psak, that everything is in order, and I will do the rest.
Welcome to Homesick for Lubavitch, a podcast where we explore Lubavitch identity in the year 2024. My name is Benzi Afson, and I will be your host. Let's begin. Alrighty, I'm here with Rabbi Michoel Seligson in Crown Heights, who is a teacher and a mechaber of an author of multiple svarim. Most notably, the Mafteach on Sichas Kodesh. I think it was 20 years ago, or a little bit more than 20 years ago. I was in Gan Yisrael, Parksville, in Masmidim. I think it was in the Masmidim group. I forgot what it was called. And we had a guest for most of the tefillas. You were, I guess, staying in the
Nearby bungalow colony in the Krinskis.
Yeah, nearby bungalow colony, and you were for
my mother.
For your mother. And I remember you came with us on the bus ride to. We were your minion, I guess. So you came with us on a bus ride to Toronto, right? Niagara Falls, and there was an amusement park, and I remember to this day how we were at the amusement park. We all went in. You clearly had no use for the amusement park. You came for the minyan. You sat the whole day while we were in the amusement park outside working on your mafteach. It was for me a boy coming from Hong Kong. It was quite a mechzet to see, someone working on a sefer like that, and also can something important. Busy with something important, and. It left a lasting impression. In any case, a few months ago, I was here in this very office to interview you for a video project, and we were speaking a little bit about your father, the late Dr. Seligson, the Dr. Avrohom Abba Seligson, who was known by many as the Rebbe's doctor. Did the Rebbe refer to him as his doctor?
The Rebbe mentioned a friend, but in a practical sense, the Rebbe would refer many people to him, and he was also the Rebbe's personal doctor.
Right, so he was known as Rebbe's doctor, and we were speaking about it, and he told me that you had a sefer about him, and a biography about him, and I asked you if I could borrow a copy. You were kind enough to give me a copy, and I took it home, and I think I opened it up that Shabbos. And I read it cover to cover. I found it absolutely. It's not a very large. What was it? 150 pages, 200 pages.
Probably could be less.
Less even, right? It's not very long.
Came out to the first year, so that's whatever we had. But right. Later there are additions.
Right, it's not very long, but I was absolutely fascinated by it, and I asked you if you would be willing to come on the podcast to talk about. Dr. Seligson, who led an incredibly fascinating and just fascinating life, and you were kind enough to agree. So thank you very much for coming on.
Welcome.
Right. So let me bring it a little bit closer, unless you want to talk a little bit louder, whatever's more comfortable for you. So let's begin with your father's early life in, remind me, was it Poland?
Krakow.
It moved, right?
Krakow originally.
Right.
My father was born in Krakow, 1907. Tafresh Samach Zayin. Happened to be a day right before Tisha B'Av. And his father was originally from Russia, from Velizh, as a descendant of the Alter Rebbe, from the Alter Rebbe's middle son. But since the Shidduch was in Poland, so my grandfather stayed there. Then World War I broke out, and he stayed weiter. Continued staying, and then came the World War II already, and this is where my father started running running away from Poland. But in between, as he was growing up, he went to medical school,
Right.
and he studied in Vilna, Strasbourg, and then doing his research in Austria, Vienna, and then he worked in the Krakow hospital, the Jewish Krakow hospital before the war, and then he left Poland when the war broke out. And in this interim, he also wrote articles in French, in Polish. Some were published, and some did not make it into publishing because the war broke out.
Can you describe a little bit one of the things that was really interesting to me was how your grandfather, was his name also Michoel?
Yeah.
You're named after your grandfather.
Yeah.
So one of the things that was interesting was how you describe him being the only chossid in Krakow, the only Lubavitcher chossid.
Right.
Can you describe a little bit how you understand the way Lubavitchers used to live back then? I know you said he came for a shidduch, but the idea of Lubavitchers living so much, like Krakow was a big city. It was not a village.
Mm-hmm.
Like, what was this idea that Lubavitchers would just live by themselves? Was that a normal thing?
He lived there because he got married there, and then he became part of the community. To a certain extent, he was a gabbai, or in the shul, Megala Muke shul. And he signed on certain papers, certain meetings they had, so they had minutes recording what was taking place. And the Friedricher Rebbe stayed in his house in around the middle of 1905, 1907, and the Friedricher Rebbe stayed there. This was in the lifetime of the Rebbe Rashab. And then 1933, we find a letter that the previous Rebbe is writing that he would like to have a chossid shir in the house of Rabbi Michoel Seligson. Chossid shir. And he picks Rabbi Mentlik, who was learning in yeshiva then.
Right.
They should send him for Shabbos. And my grandfather, as mentioned, was the only Lubavitcher chossid. And the previous Rebbe saw this as an activity to be mekarev, to introduce other yeshiva bachim to chassidus.
What was Rabbi Mentlik doing there?
Rabbi Mentlik did not live there. He learned in the yeshiva. But
Where?
He learned in Lubavitch.
Oh, this is already
talking about
It's already
talking about 1933. So in that time period, it was already in Poland. So he came from a different city for Shabbos, and he would go back after Shabbos.
So your Zayda lived in
Krakow.
From 1907, you said?
My Zayda got married there in 1904.
So from 1904 to 1933...
1933, he lived in Krakow.
He's living there by himself as a
lived
Lubavitcher.
Right.
And your grandmother was not from a Lubavitch family?
My grandmother was from a different yichas. They stem from my father, my grandfather, my grandmother. They had the yichas from the Ramah. They came from the Megala Mukes, from Nata Shapiro. They're different daily Yisrael. We have a Megillas HaYuchsim. We have the whole genealogy.
I'm not questioning the yichas. I'm just my shaila is I'm trying to understand how did Chassidim live back then? It's very like it was surprising to me that you would have, because your grandfather also came from a very miyuchasdik Lubavitch family, and he would choose to marry a girl from a not Lubavitch family and live in a community where he's the only Lubavitcher. Was that something that the Rebbe encouraged him to do? Was that something the Lubavitchers did back then?
It's an interesting point because I never actually thought about it, but he was a very involved community person. He got my father, after my father was nifter, I found a note that he wrote. He wrote it for himself, and I used it later for the Sefer. My father says he has crossed from continent to continent. He did not find a personality like his father.
Like your grandfather?
Like my grandfather. He says, Bikur Chelim, Chavre Kadisha, everything, helping people. He was like a community person throughout the whole time. In a sense, there is Rabbi Lowy, Rabbi Lowenthal.
Oh, yes.
So he
Which
visited
one?
Naftali Lowenthal.
Oh, the grandfather.
Yeah,
he was on the podcast.
Yeah, so he visited Krakow when it was 700 years of Jews in Krakow.
Uh-huh.
And he heard that I have a connection to Krakow. So he asked me if I have any information. I said, yeah, sure, I can give you a lot of information. So he spoke in Krakow, and he later sent me his article. And he mentioned that Krakow stood out for three things. Bechlal, the Yiddish community. And then there was also there were different sort of Schnitter, which started to develop. And then he says in a very subtle way, when the Friedrich Rebbe was asking to make shiurim and to be mekarev bachalim techsidis Chabad, this was the first Chabad house.
Huh.
He says, Mom is the first Chabad house. So the Friedrich Rebbe asked my grandfather. My grandfather was poshet working. I mean, we don't have too much information, but basically, as it's understood, it was an open house that people came and identified with Chabad, connected to Chabad, interested themselves in Chabad. And actually all the siblings, some of the siblings of my grandfather, one of them lived in Vilna, who supported the Lubavitch Yeshiva in Vilna in the time of the Rebbe Rashabiat. So they were all basically community people, communal people that were involved in work.
And just a year ago, I was sitting right here recording the intro to the podcast. And at the time, it was just an idea. Sitting here today thinking about where the podcast has gone, I'd be lying if I told you that I had any of that in mind when I began a year ago. The podcast has led me to travel across the country, out of the country, to meet so many fascinating people, most of whom I'd never heard of before, certainly not met before, and to spend hours with them hearing their absolutely fascinating stories and ideas and perspectives, and then of course to share it with thousands of people around the world. One of the most precious parts of working on this project has been the response that I've gotten from people around the world. The graciousness and kindness and positivity has been something that I never dreamt of. Over the past year, this podcast has been completely self-funded, which is something I have absolutely zero regrets about. It has been an absolute blast, a journey of a lifetime, an experience of a lifetime. And when I think about it, probably the most important work I've ever done. But as I look towards the coming year, or years of this project, God willing, I now invite you, the listeners of Homesick for Lubavitch, to take part in making this project more sustainable. So I've created a website, hflpodcast.com, where there will be a full archive and library of all the episodes of Homesick for Lubavitch. And there will also be a link there to support the podcast, either with a monthly contribution or a one-time contribution, either of which will help make this podcast something that will be permanent, something that will be sustainable, something that will grow, something that will continue to make all of us more proud and more hopeful and more grateful to be who we are. What did it look like for your grandfather to be a chossid? Like, he was not part of a community, of a Lubavitch community. He probably didn't visit in those days, especially with the wars. Probably didn't visit, and the Rebbe Shab and the Friedrich Rebbe were in places that were hard to access anyhow. He probably didn't visit them very often. I don't know. Did he visit them at all?
I am not aware of it.
What did it look like to be a Lubavitcher chossid?
We do find correspondence with the previous Rebbe. He's writing there's shiurim, we need material, mamish poshet technische inyanim, there's svarim, other things. Interesting also is that my grandfather was also doing a lot of Chabad houses, taking people. It was the Russo-Japanese War, and there were a lot of Yidden there that were in the middle of everything. And my grandfather took in a lot of guests. He possibly would schlep guests from the shul, and he would take him into his house. And he would encourage that he didn't want maids or workers should be used for them, but basically family members alone. He wanted to train them that they should be doing Achnasas Orchim, helping in the house with these guests.
But I guess my question is, what would make him feel that he's a Lubavitcher? Like, in what sense are they Lubavitch? What does that mean?
Okay, I mean, they were the minhagim of Chabad, commemorating the Geula, the redemption of the previous Rebbe, the redemption of the Alter Rebbe. There was the custom of eating kasha, Yutas Kislev.
Right.
So they mamish kept up all his traditions, which my grandfather saw from earlier. He did not see it from his father because his father passed away when he was very young. He was the youngest.
So it was minhagim,
shiur chassidus, and even in the shul, although he was davening in not in the Lubavitcher shul, or even sometimes the Ramah shul, he davened nusachari.
Mm-hmm.
And then I found in my father a little siddur that he had, that he made notes on the margins, the difference between that nusach and nusach Chabad. So it seems like already from God early years they were connected somehow. Although in the community itself, my grandfather was a people's person. He's very much into music, and would played out the Rebbes Nigen by weddings or by certain Rebbes.
He played the violin or the cello? That I didn't know.
I think it's the cello.
The cello.
Yeah, and he would. People knew this is a Lubavitcher chossid. He was like very, very played by one of the Lubavitcher Rebbes, and Chanukah it was, and he was a people's person. And B'meila he worked out with any community. It wasn't like he felt lonely. Chassidim. He was a varme person, a freiliche person, and he was a community person. He was involved in everything, and wherever he needed to focus, he focused. So it was like. That was it. That was his place. And I never heard about his feelings. He did want to go back to Russia. That was his plan, to go back to Velizh.
Your Zayda.
My Zayda, yeah. And then the war broke out. The First World War I broke out. That's why my father couldn't even learn yeshiva, because it wasn't possible. So he would learn with my father. Mm-hmm. He would learn every night, and that's where my father got his yedias. I mean, then my father was already on his own, sitting nights and learning, and even as a teenager and later.
They learned chassidus together?
I don't know, but I know that Tanya was one thing that was by my father all over the years. But pastors, he also learned chassidus with him, because my father definitely got of the culture, Chabad culture, different things. So I'm sure he did, but I never heard anything. I never saw anything. He would write Hagoyes. Actually, I have a medrash Tanchuma with Hagoyes that my grandfather wrote. But he raised them as a Lubavitcher. My father was raised as a Lubavitcher.
Yeah, I mean that to me is what's so interesting here, because we're going to get to it later in the story. But your father certainly considers himself a Lubavitcher chossid, but he had a very unusual, it seems, upbringing, mm-hmm. Right?
Right. I mean, he didn't have companions. He didn't have it wasn't like a kehillah there.
Right.
Also, it could very well be that because when my grandfather was a child, 7 years old, his father passed away. So he was raised and coached by his older brother, Avrohom Seligson, from Vilna. So he lived in Vilna and he lived in Krakow. So I'm sure they were in contact with each other at certain points.
Your father with his uncle.
My grandfather with his brother.
With his brother.
And my father with his uncle, when he studied in Vilna, he would stay by his uncle in Vilna.
And his uncle was more of like a typical chossid, you're saying?
Yeah. Beyond everything, he was one of the pillars of Tem Chitmim in Vilna.
And there was a larger Lubavitch community in Vilna.
It seemed like, but pashtus there was, because there was a yeshiva there, so there was a community. And he would come to the shiurim there from a famous Rov, Rabbi Reines, certain name, and he would be known as a Baal Tzedakah. My grandfather and my father and my granduncle, and the community knew him to the extent that the Rebbe Rashab was planning to close the yeshiva in Vilna because there was a certain issue, they couldn't support it. And the Rebbe Rashab writes about him that he came with tears in his eyes, my granduncle saying that Teimche Tmimim was the light in the city, was the apple, the eye, and how could we close it?
Huh.
So this is the Friedrich Rebbe Rashab mentions it. And it's interesting because the Rebbe Rashab writes on my granduncle, he writes Sheir Psori, relative.
Because they're both from
Right, but my grandfather, he doesn't mention, he just mentions Hanogid, the Hanogid Rabbi Michoel Seligson.
Interesting. Who was the Anhala? Was there any famous chossid, the Anhala of this
Rabbi
yeshiva?
Uspal was in Vilna,
Was Rosh Yeshiva.
he became one Rosh Yeshiva. He was, I think, Rabbi Gustman also. He was the Rabbi Uspal, later as Rosh Yeshiva in Bedford and Dean,
Right.
Lubavitcher Yeshiva.
Right.
There were a few names. There was an article written by Rabbi Shmuel Heber about that yeshiva in Teimche Tmimim in Vilna.
Yeah, so I find that very, very interesting, because I just, your father obviously eventually came to Lubavitch or came back, not came to, he was always a Lubavitcher, but came to 770 and ended up being a very big figure in Crown Heights. But he lived a very individual or unique life, right? You were saying earlier he couldn't go to yeshiva because of the war. He ended up going to school. Is that why he ended up going to school, or he always wanted to go?
No, he learned, he couldn't go to yeshiva, so his father learned with him.
Right.
Because his uncles were very much into health, into
From his
psychology.
mother's,
From his mother's side. So therefore there were about 13, I think. So it was a big family. So that gave him a feel to help others.
I see.
And in his nature, he was a person that was humanitarian and wanted to help others. So that's when he studied medicine. And it wasn't easy because originally they didn't want to accept him in school.
Right.
It seems like they didn't want any Jews in,
Right.
Later, a year later, when a lot of them dropped out, that's when they accepted him. So he learned in Vilna and Strasbourg. He took it very serious. European doctor was a different school.
Was that something that the frum yidden in those days, besides the hardship of the anti-Semites, was it something from yidden like high talking you go to school, or in that family that was more of a accepted thing already?
The family, mitzad his mother's side, they were into it, but my father was, he had a lot of limitations as studying medicine, and here you have Shabbos, here you have other things. And he was like, as they say, kachut hasayda, he was like right on top of everything. It wasn't any questions, he would right away check with Rabbonim.
Right.
He was like a frum betachlis, and people remember him yet from Krakow, how he davened, and it was near the Oren Kodesh. The Rebbe once said to him in later years, you are walking on a tightrope, halacha and medicine. It's a difficult situation, the Rebbe told him. You have to take in consideration both.
Right.
But he always mastered that. In fact, when he came here to the United States, 1950s, 55, I don't think it ever happened before, he made a conference of religious doctors.
Yes, I read that in the book.
Yeah, 25 doctors came. It was a big hatzlacha.
And the Rebbe sent him a letter also, right?
Yeah, a letter addressing the group of doctors in Hebrew and in English. And it's the Rebbe speaks there about prevention, speaks there about the positive feelings of a patient. Very interesting tips. This is in summer 1955.
So let's get back to that. Later. Your father goes to school to become a doctor. And you said he has to the entire time be very careful about in a sense balancing these two worlds that, especially in those days, was not built to go together at all.
Mm-hmm.
What did he ever talk to you about that? Did he ever describe it to you?
Not really. No, he never spoke about. I did find in his notes, he was in touch with Rabbonim, different things, but he never spoke with me about, what it meant, school. I do know that somebody once told me from Krakow who wanted their son should go to school in a certain city, I think it was in Paris, in France, and my father says, "I'll check it out." And he checked it out. He came back. He says it's not for him. So my father saw all the trials, these nisyenas, these different tests, the experiences that a person could have. And for a certain person, my father felt it wasn't right. It wasn't advisable. Well, my father himself was very strong, was a very disciplined person, and he like held in very strong. And Baruch Hashem, he managed with the schedules and everything going on in the school. In that time, it was a little different than the United States, but he managed.
That's what I want to ask you. Where did he get the trust for himself to go to school? Because I think you told me that also when we met last time, that he discouraged people later on because he understood what was so challenging about it. Why did he trust himself? Why do you think he trusted himself?
My father, when he wanted to do something and he felt he can do it, he went for it. If he felt that he cannot do it, he just moved off from it, because he knew exactly what he's shaykh to do, what not. I mean, in fact, I once told my father there are certain people that they can't look at blood, so they can't become doctors. My father said he also had that.
Amish.
Yeah, but he says he overcame it. Father was a very, very disciplined person in everything, and he really built himself up in a way that any challenge that he had, which he felt it has to be overcome, he managed. Mm-hmm. If it was something important to him that he felt this is mamish negeya, either halacha or saving people, as he did in Shanghai.
You used a very interesting word earlier. You called him a humanitarian. That is not a word that I am familiar or used to hearing as a description of a chossid. Humanitarian are the people that go to Africa, and you know what I mean.
Okay, so
I'm not catching you on a
no,
word.
Actually, if it's a word,
it's not a bad word.
Yeah, but
it's usually a very
humanitarian. I mean, to me, is he liked people.
Right.
He tried to help people. He listened to people. He had patients that came to him, and he told them exactly what to do. An hour later, he calls him up. He says, "I thought it over, and I think this will be better for you." So this is how he was like very involved in the person's life and the person's experience. And people are amazed. Like, who do you have a doctor today that will call up and say, "You know what? I think there's a better way to do it." Right. He was always thinking, what could he do? How could he improve something? How could he enhance a person's health? It was Pasha, this whole sitting and thinking. A lot of his...
A true rofeh did.
A true rofeh did. Mamash involved in every detail.
So what I'm trying to get at, or I'm trying to understand from you, is that, because I'm trying to understand, here's this bacher, and then eventually he got married a bit later on in life, right? But a young man who decides to become a doctor, even though he's still, a frum yedid, a Lubavitcher chossid in his own way, because it's an unusual circumstance. What is the dominant striving in his life, right? He's not trying to be a fancy balabas with a lot of money, from what you're telling me. Like, that's not why he's becoming a doctor, right? What is he after? Like, what's his magmase? What is he striving for? And you're saying that he cared about people.
He cared about people, and in essence, he could have been a scientist. He was doing research. He was in touch with the Yale University. It was Howard Cushing.
Yeah, I saw that.
He was a top neurosurgeon of the century. And my father was doing experiments and research, and he was sending the reports to the United States. It was Connecticut. And he was responding back and saying, it's interesting, this observation. Yeah, Dr. Zelix. I mean,
very obscure field, right?
Yeah, it was in the pituitary, and it was about hypertension. It was different articles that he wrote. And chassidim who knew him here in the United States, or they knew him from Poland, they said he could have easily been a scientist. He had an original mind.
Right.
Always came up. I mean, even doctors from here said, Dr. Seligson has an original mind, and he can be superb in everything. But instead, he decided to help people, to be a doctor physically, to help people.
Wow.
That was his chayes. And as you mentioned, money was not the thing by him at all. It was pashit. Either bepnimius onyanim it's al avos Yisrael, or is it because he saw by his father that his father also helped people? But this was his nature.
What's so interesting to me and why I'm sitting on it a little bit is on one hand it's so unusual, and on the other hand it makes so much sense. Right? On one hand, like, how many chassidim back in that day, in that time, became doctors? Probably only him. Maybe, I don't know everybody. But
in those years it was.
I never heard
somebody mamish a chossid born in Lubavitcher, and it was unusual.
Yeah, I remember the first time we met. I assumed when I asked you, I said, "When did your father come to Lubavitch?" Right? I assumed that he must have about tshuva, no, or
came from another source.
Yeah, but Lubavitchers aren't doctors in those days, right? He told me, no, he comes from Lubavitch, right? So on one hand, it's very unusual. On the other hand, the way you're explaining it, it makes a lot of sense. What do you mean? He comes from a chassidish mishpacha. There's a lot of Avos Yisrael and achas and just caring about other people, tzarchei tzibur, putting other people first, and he had a mind for medicine. Clearly, his family had a history of medicine, so that's what he did. But there's something very, very like glatik about it in a way, right? Even though it sounds like a stira.
Right. They were his uncles, for example, were not mamish medical doctors. Psychology, whatever it was, but it was an atiyah to that, and my father had it inborn in him to help people.
But what's also interesting is that once he came to America, you said that he discouraged people from following this path.
No, it was in Poland itself.
Right.
When somebody asked him in this community that their son wants to become a doctor.
Yes, I understand. But you told me last time that he would discourage people also here.
Here,
not so much.
Not so much. No, I don't think people asked, and I didn't hear anything. I mean, there was a lot going on. We're talking about private things with people. My father Michoel didn't discuss at home anything. And on the other hand, he once mentioned to me, he never mentioned names, but he mentioned a case, a scenario of a father turning to my father as a psychologist. His son is a kleptomaniac. He's constantly stealing. Is there anything he can do for it? So my father was a medical doctor. But because my father, as a European doctor, he also understood psychology. So he would give advice to people.
Right.
So it was basically, I mean, he knew everything. He as they say, chossid passed away a few years ago in Crown Heights, famous chossid. He said to me that in the past, when a person went to a doctor, the doctor knew everything, every part of the body. Today, it's you go to a foot doctor, you go to a heart doctor, cardiologist, you go to every kind of that, lung doctor. He says then a pulmonary doctor. Today, so he once said to the doctor, this chassid, he says, "Doctor, what are you cutting me apart into separate sections? I want you treat me as a whole."
Right.
But in those years, in my father's time, although my father Taka knew everything, but out of modesty, his profession was throat, stomach. There were three things that he practiced, and other things. His modesty, he always would send to an expert. And he would sometimes go to the expert, that person in Manhattan, and the expert would sometimes have no idea exactly how to deal with it. You come back to my father, and my father would tell him what to do. There's a story, it's a famous story that I heard from someone, that they heard from the person, that my father, he came once to my father for a visit, and my father gave him the diagnosis, and this person felt like my father took a few dollars. He felt he wanted to get an opinion from a doctor in Manhattan. Taking big money makes him a reputation. So he went to another doctor. Came to the other doctor in Manhattan, and after he examines him, he says to him, "Wait in my office. I'll be with you in a minute." The doctor gets on the phone, the other room. He says, Dr. Zelix, what do you think about this case? Lepel, and he asked him, so how much is it? $250. So I didn't realize, because my father, with his modesty, the Rebbe once said he's a lametvovnik. My father, with his modesty, never boasted. Go to an expert. I don't want to say anything. But if he saw the person is lost, they came back to him, and he was the one that came out with the solution.
One second, you just said that. You also said the derech agav. They use a lametvovnik. That was something that the Rebbe said often about people.
Often, I don't know, but I know that the Rebbe mentioned it in Yechidus to my mother. In regards to a certain inyan, that there's no day, there's no night, so the Rebbe said, was wilter, the lametvovnik. That's the way the Rebbe said it.
And your mother told you the story?
My mother told me the story. I heard it from her.
After he passed away, or
no, it was in 1968. She was in Yechidus.
No, but she told you the story after he passed away.
No, before.
And he ever paid attention to this story, or?
No, I don't think it. He mamish demanded of himself. Everything is lehechsik teva latzmei. He never took credit for things. He was always, always very, very disciplined, and, Teira Yerushalayim. He didn't speak much. He wasn't like a person who sits down and tells stories. He would sit by a meal. He would like to hear a Dvar Teira, and that's it. And after that, he would bench. If there were some stories that he had experiences with the Rebbe that he remembered, or better yet, I asked him about, he would clarify it.
He didn't like to talk? He was not a friendly person?
He was, with patience, he would talk, everything, but he did not, it wasn't like an extra word. I mean, I once heard a word somebody said, I don't know where it comes from. Somebody says the Beinini of Tanya. He was very careful. I'm
saying, did he take you on trips when you were a kid?
He took us on trips, yeah. As little kids, he took us on trips to park, this, that. He would buy toys for us. I mean,
it wasn't a verkvetschmensch.
No, in ganzen nicht.
Right.
Not at all that. But I'm saying in time, he didn't go on vacation much.
Right.
He felt that he can't leave the community. You don't see anybody like that. He cannot leave the community summer because he is responsible for the community.
It sounds almost like a pshittis, like a certain pshittis. Like everything just makes sense. Everything is just what needs to be is what it is.
Yes, it is. And it was, if he went for vacation, he went for a few days and he came back. He was a doctor in camp for a year. One summer or 2 summers.
Gan
Yisrael in the early 60s, I remember. But generally, he went where he was needed. He was a doctor originally in the 1940s in Teira Badas, the yeshiva there.
When he first came to America.
Yeah.
So let's not skip. There's a very big part of the story here that we're skipping. That between him going to school in Europe and coming to America, he had a very significant detour in Japan and Shanghai.
Mm-hmm.
And when I was reading the book in Shanghai, he was living with the Lubavitchers there, right? And that, in a way, that was the first time that he was living.
I think in Japan he already had a Shanghai. 6 months he was there in Kobe.
Right.
So it could be that he was already in that neighborhood, and then from there they went to Shanghai.
And he lived with the Lubavitcher.
He lived in the yard where the yeshiva was, in the same yard.
Right, and it seems like that's when it became clear to other people that, even though in some ways he didn't look like a Lubavitcher, right? I don't think he had a beard at that time.
He didn't have a beard, but
but they understood. They understood that this is a Lubavitcher chossid.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah, I mean they knew that he was a Lubavitcher. He was there 5 years.
Right.
And they turned to him as a doctor, and the Mir Yeshiva turned to him, and the Chachmi Lublin Yeshiva turned to him. All the yeshivas turned to him, the students. There were also Buddhists that came to him.
Right.
He was Yidden Buddhist. He was very accepted. There were
Buddhists. You mean the communists, the Bundists?
The Yidden who were, I think they were Buddhists.
Oh, Buddhists.
Buddhists.
No, because also Bundists, right?
No, Buddhists. That's what I once heard.
There were Yidden in Shanghai that considered themselves Buddhists, or not Yidden.
Buddhists. I don't know what they were, but they
were Yidden.
They came.
They were Yidden or not Yidden?
I'm not sure, but they came to my father as a doctor because they trusted him. In fact, somebody, Rabbi Fuchs, who was in Shanghai, told me that there were the two sections, the Shanghai, like Brooklyn and Manhattan.
Right.
In Manhattan, they had older senior doctors.
Right.
And in the other section in Shanghai, they had the immediate, which was the ghetto. Actually, they were living in ghetto. They had one. They had a few doctors. My father was amongst them. When a doctor would come to the section to the senior doctor, they would ask one question: "Were you ready by Dr. Seligson?"
Huh.
If they said yes, they said we have nothing to add.
In the chossid section
In the
of town.
section, the senior doctors. They knew that my father diagnosed it, and whatever it is, they can't say anything additional.
Look, I don't know if this is appropriate to say, and I don't know how you're going to react to it, but there's such a striking parallel to your father's story with the Rebbe's story. Before the Rebbe became Rebbe, when the Rebbe was more private, and the parallels of a person who is clearly a goyin, right? I'm not trying to say they're the same person, but there's a parallel here, right? Where clearly a genius, right? Clearly a mumche in what he's doing. Clearly a elevated yid, and yet extremely private and not looking to make a tzimis at all. Right, he knew that he could help a lot of people, and whoever came to him, he helped. But he never made a scene.
Right. I never saw it that way, and I probably, it's like two different people. But
And of course,
but my father was, in a sense, very modest. Nobody had any idea even who was the Rebbe's doctor those years, and they would think it's someone in Manhattan.
right?
The calls would come through the house by us. How many times I picked up the phone when the Rebbetzin called.
The Rebbe would call about the Rebbe.
Yeah, or about herself.
And they would come to him to how he would go to their house.
He would go to the house or see the Rebbe in 770.
Right.
There was one time, he's calling about privacy. There was one time that the Rebbe told my father when he was leaving, when the Rebbe was leaving the house for 770, that my father should not come in the same time to 770. People shouldn't realize that he's coming from the house, that you're coming from me, as he komt from mir. The privacy that the Rebbe had when he gave his health, he did not want in any way,
He didn't want people to know that your father was coming from his house.
Right. Because people start talking, health, mice,
right.
The Rebbe didn't want anything.
Yeah. Look, to me, it almost like it makes sense that the Rebbe would trust your father. It just the way of life.
He was a person. He was a very close person. Even when it came to health issues, it could be years later, 14 years. There was a certain issue that happened in the 60s. In 78, it came out. It's like, and nobody knew anything. Not in the house, nowhere.
But it's not just that he was a trust, that you could trust him with a secret. It was also, there's a certain, because to me there's a certain pele with the Rebbe. Like, he knew that he was such. I'm talking about when he was before he became Rebbe. He knew that he was a massive Talmid Chacham. He knew that, but he and you could say, well, if I know so much, I need to go and tell the world and help people. There's
Fakerti, in a sense, the Rebbe said that the short suit.
Right, and he hit himself. And your father has there's a similar thing there. I don't know what it is exactly, but
it's, I don't know. I see it. My father, I would say independently, I would not connect that he was a modest person. He knew a lot, and people didn't realize. After he passed away, they realized how much he knew medicine,
right,
and how much he was a Talmid Chacham.
It's almost like true genius and true.
The modesty.
Right.
That's where you find his modesty. He was. The Rebbe once said about him that if he would be amongst the literature world, he would be one of the top there.
In Torah.
In Torah.
Yeah, I mean. That was astonishing. You open up the book and you think that you're going to hear about Dr. Zelix medicine, and you hear about that, but then you see a diagram. I put it on the internet the other day. This diagram of did he draw this during the war?
He wrote in 1935.
So before the war.
Yeah, and he sent it to someone here in Queens.
But it was a medical school.
It seems like in 1935 he was 28. He was already after medical school.
But I'm saying he wasn't in yeshiva.
No,
He
no, it
wasn't in
wasn't
yeshiva.
yeshiva.
And you have to see this diagram. He draws a picture of an ox, and every piece of anatomy of the ox he has a marmokim, and it's not the easy marmokim.
Yeah. Maramakim in the Talmud and in the commentaries, the Poskim.
Right, and Rashi al Torah everywhere.
And actually, another Indian comes in here about modesty, that he writes. He writes. Anybody could make copies of it, and he signs his name.
Everybody can have it.
Yeah, everybody copies. Avrohom Abba Seligson. He signs his name. Now, this is interesting because he wrote into the Rebbe. He sent this into the Rebbe
At the time.
In the 70s.
Oh, so years later he shared it.
He sent it to the Rebbe. So I don't know exactly what it implied. If he asked if it should be published, if it should be published, whatever the Rebbe says, just give it over. That Rav Meir should just give a review, a quick review. So it was given to Rabbi Yitzchak Pekarsky, who was a Pesach,
Rosh Hashiva of
770, and he looked it over and says, "Dus, alles in Ordnung." So that's what my father wrote, Baskomas Hagon Rabbi Yitzchak Pekarsky. But when you look at it, it's mamish amazing. It's like actually Hilchas Treifas, Bochelim 770, when they saw this, because there was a certain printer, it was gross, the printing, so he made big copies of it, large. And Bochelim are learning Hilchas Treifas from this seal, because it has it all. I spoke with someone who's in Argentina, Rapinha Baumgarten.
Sure, and I know Pinny.
Yeah, Pinny. He says this was most helpful because it has it all in one picture. Right. It's not like they break it down in different pages.
So you're saying that he sent it in 1935
He sent it to a friend of a friend, and for whatever reason he sent it there, and after the war he got it back.
He sent the original to Queens.
I think he sent it even there, yeah.
That's how it survived the war.
Survived the war, yeah.
Wow.
That's what we understand.
Wow. So your father he ends up escaping from Krakow to Japan. There's a few.
And they got sick on the way, or seasick, and my father treated them.
Right. There's another fascinating story in the book that one of the things that he happened to study in school in the stomach, right? They said, "Why are you studying this?" In the end, he saved the yedid in Shanghai, right?
Right. All the different diseases they had.
Yeah.
Dysentery.
But specifically
he decided stomach. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, but so he goes from Poland to Japan and ends up in Shanghai, and he's there for a few years.
He's there in 5 years. Yeah.
5 years.
From 41 to 46. To
right.
That,
right. He's already in his 30s at this point.
He's from the last ones to leave.
Right.
Poland. I'm sorry, the last ones to leave Shanghai, and the Rebbe was publishing many Svarim there in Shanghai. Chabad published Svarim there in Shanghai.
Right.
And since my father was
for
the last...
For the Lubavitch,
for Chabad, yeah.
For the Lubavitch that lived there.
Yeah. So, actually, some of the Svarim I have here. And Teres Chaim, Imri Bina, it's a whole bunch. And Terer Sider, Terer Sider came actually, it says Shanghai, Tovshin Vov also, could be from there. And when he came here, he got a call from the Rebbe. It was in winter time, I think early 47. He got a call that he's going to send a bacher to pick up a set of Svarim for the previous Rebbe. Because my father brought a set for the Friedrich Rebbe and for himself. So
from Shanghai.
Yeah. So
why did he need this from Shanghai?
The Rebbe printed Svarim Shanghai. What everybody knew about made in China, the Rebbe was the first one.
You printed Svarim in Shanghai for Lubavitch in America.
Yeah.
I thought he was printing in Shanghai for the chassidim in Shanghai.
No. It was they printed it there because there was a base there. There was chassidim there. So the 29 bacharim.
It was cheaper there to print there.
Exactly.
Wow.
So they.
So we're already
even when they were on the way back, the Rebbe was still sending. He wanted to print more Svarim, but they were already coming back. So my father managed to get. There's some instructions to the printer. The Rebbe sent everything.
How did the printer in Shanghai already have Hebrew fonts? They arranged it.
It was an offset. So he just needed offset, and
Ah,
they
it
have on
already
every bagging, every little bind of the page, you have over here some Chinese. You can see some Chinese.
Yeah.
Oh yeah.
I grew up in Hong Kong. That's why I've been to Shanghai. It's very interesting.
So this is mamish very interesting. So they printed it there. And the Rebbe mentioned it to the Fabrengen. B'negia the Sheva Brachas of Rebbe to bring him Svarim that were published in Shanghai. I think the Rebbe mentioned then the 50 years anniversary, Yudalet Kislev, Tavshin Lamates.
In Tavshin Lamates.
The Rebbe mentioned that during the Sheva Brachas they were bringing gifts to the Friedrich Rebbe.
So they were printing. Oh wait, they were printing.
They printed things, and the
Rebbe
got it
in the pays already.
Not in the pays, in the Tavshins to Tavshin Vav.
Okay.
But it seems like maybe it needs a little understanding because the previous Rebbe's anniversary was Tavshin Zayin, summer 1947. Mm-hmm. I married in 1897, so it's 1947. But they came winter. So I always had that question, like, how does it work out? Because I know my father brought a bunch of Svarim already a set, but it could be there were some things that were completed later, and the Rebbe made sure the Friedrich Rebbe should get it.
50 years to the Friedrich Rebbe's wedding, they printed in Shanghai.
Right. So the Rebbe said that there was Svarim that they brought in from Shanghai. So the Rebbe said that it was something that they wanted to bring a simcha to the Friedrich Rebbe, and the Rebbe says that's the only anniversary where we can find 50th anniversary, the previous Rebbe. Because the others were either younger or we don't know what took place.
What did your father? You said your father did not speak much, but did he ever speak to you about the years in Shanghai? Did he? Yes.
I wanted to put something together in his lifetime, just asking questions with Chulu. And since the family wanted to have memoirs, so he did write up his birth and everything up to Shanghai. Shanghai he didn't want to speak about.
He didn't want to speak about it.
I don't want to speak about it. He didn't mention...
Why not?
I don't know. Either because of certain aspects that took place there, whatever it is. But he didn't want to, and nobody actually, Lubavitcher Rebbe, the older Bacham, did not want to speak about it. They spoke about the situations they went through. My father did mention, I think, that you couldn't drink water without cooking it. Different aspects. My father...
You're talking about the Gashmisike Schwierigkeiten.
Yeah, Gashmisike difficulties. And my father... there were diseases. There was cholera. There was typhus. There was malaria. I mean, there was a child needed to be inoculated for 5 diseases. 8-month-old, she had to be inoculated.
I guess what I'm curious to know is did your father at that point, for all the difficulties that were going on, was there something that he felt a new connection with this group of people? This was the first time that he was living with other chassidim. My
father, in a sense,
he was always the same person.
He liked people. He liked to fabring with people, but he was not, because he felt mitzad time and mitzad the value of time. He wasn't like a social person, a club person.
Right.
To say it in a club person. He wasn't allowed to hang out here, hang out there. He knew the Rebbe's Fabring, he went to the Fabringen.
Oh, he would come to the Fabringens?
Yeah, all the Fabringens he went, as late as they were, he went to Fabringens.
But would he ever Fabring with other chassidim?
Once a year, he would have a Melava Malka for his Yemaledes Nachamu, right after Tisha B'Av. He was born out of Tisha B'Av. So he would have Melava Malka, Rabbi Meyeritken, Rabbi Sisonkin, and other chassidim. They would tell Sipurim. My father just enjoyed it.
Where did he know them from? From Crown Heights. He didn't know them from before.
Yeah, from Crown Heights. There were certain people he knew from Shanghai, Rabbi Fuchs, Rabbi Sheila Brunstein, Rabbi Lander. Many people lived in Crown Heights, Rabbi Shimon Goldman. But when people came to my father, some of the people that he knew from Shanghai, he would have conversations with them, talk with them. It was like, you can see that there was a closeness between them.
There was a closeness.
Yeah. There are certain people, my father spoke with them. Certain people, like just speaking a little and learning, he would ask, what bracha do you make on this cereal, that cereal, like halacha, out of the way, he would just discuss it. Some people he had a different relationship with them. So some people knew him as a doctor, some people knew him as a Talmud Chacham. And people went over to me after he was nifter. They said, we had no idea who he is.
Who knew him as a friend? Is my question.
Rabbi Fuchs
Rabbi Fuchs.
knew him as a friend.
They were close.
All the Shanghai knew him because he was there with them 5 years.
Right.
Rabbi Landau, I
And-
interviewed before he was nifter.
They went through a lot together.
Yeah, so the mamas, they were on the same boat. So they really knew. They knew him. They spoke very highly of him. I mean, Rabbi Fuchs once said, I can speak a whole night about him.
By on the same boat, you literally mean the same boat, right? Not
Same boat.
Not
and,
not Adarch Mashal. Like literally the same boat.
Mamish, I mean, they were on the same, right. 5 years they were suffering all together in Shanghai. There were 29 Bacharim. My father said, this is one of the things he said about Shanghai, they were called the B-29 bombers because the previous Rebbe would constantly bomb the consulate to get them visas. So they
Out
used
of
to, out of Shanghai. So they used to call them the B-29 bombers. My father once mentioned that. Very few things my father mentioned about Shanghai.
So
what
he was
did,
he was one of the 29. He was considered one.
I
of the
don't
29?
know. I don't know. There is a picture of all of them. I don't remember because my father didn't learn in the yeshiva there. He was in the same chossid, in the same yard. He had a house there, an apartment. He would sit and learn at night. Rabbi Fuchs would tell me that my father would go in at night, take svarim from the yeshiva. He says, he always said, he didn't take it for exercise. He says, but he sits and learn, and at night in the morning he would return it. So he was a very close person, a close.
It's a stunning story. That's Adarch Rashi, like like learning and making no footprints.
Yeah, I mean,
no footprints.
Here in the United States, which I can testify, he had a stroke when he was in his 40s.
He had a stroke.
And his grandfather passed away. He's named after his grandfather when he was 45.
So it runs in the family.
So it was in the family that, so it was after the war, so my father had a stroke. There's the bracha from the Rebbe. There's also sort of a mefes. And Baruch Hashem, he came out of it, and the Rebbe encouraged him to go back to work. And very much like to get back on his feet. And the Rebbe told him to be careful with our health. Different tips. And nevertheless, his schedule all the years, as far as we remember, he would get up in the morning 7:30. He would prepare for davening. He would daven in 7:70, the Bacharim Minyan 9:30. 10 o'clock was Kriyas HaTorah, it was Monday or Thursday. He would then be in 7:70. He had his little corner there. People would come to be checked out. And,
he checked out patients there.
Yeah, they'll say people that didn't come to his house, he checked out there. And he, and something he didn't need much to check out. Like, Marshall, you had a group of Chaver going to Australia. And the Rebbe wanted, the condition was, one of the things was going to a doctor. And the Rebbe mentioned they should check by my father. Bacha came to my father. Today he mentions the story many times. He's in Montreal, in Menayel, in the school. Rabbi Yosel Minkovich.
Oh, yes.
So he says, came to my father. If they check out, you can think a whole thorough. My father looks in his eyes. Everything in order. The Kensgain.
Mamish.
That was it. That's the way medicine worked in the past, Used to look in
You
the
could see
eyes.
the eyes.
Yeah. I mean, the Gemara says that the eyes is the reflection of the body. So basically, the Rebbe would sometimes come out in the Gan Eden Atachten, would ask different Yonim, Benegir Refuah and Yonim. And there were different miracles.
Personal things?
Not
No.
personal things, letters that he got. And so there was one time the Rebbe walked out with a telegram, and he asked my father a certain again, if there's anything new in medicine. My father was, as mentioned, busy a whole day. He was in 770. Then he started to go home. He came home 3 o'clock. This is after doing home visits also. 3 o'clock, I had a whole line of people waiting for him in the house. He didn't feel comfortable to sit down and eat. He had very, very refined manners. I feel to take something to eat, nothing. He had a few things that he took along, something to nibble on in shul that he took along, but he couldn't sit and eat while people were there. And that's how it went. And then if there was an emergency, there was no Hatzalah then, everything came to him. About 10, 11 o'clock when things started to slow down, he sat down and learned. Learned till about 4 in the morning.
And then get up again 7:30.
Yeah. And the learning was basically Gemara, he wrote comments on Gemara. He wrote comments on the Tanya. The Rebbe asked him for the Tanya, and the Tanya actually is in the Rebbe's library today.
The Rebbe asked him for his Tanya.
For his Tanya, he was learning Tanya together to learn with Rabbi Michoel Rubin from Montreal. And Rabbi Michoel Rubin heard the biurim from Rabbi Yitzchak, from Isaac Baruch, who was a mashpia in yeshiva. And in addition to that, my father, Bechlal, was very into citing sources for everything.
Right.
So b'meila, he saw every expression in Tanya, he has a source. He was a baki in Tanakh, my father. Learned Tanya, learned Gemara every night, learned Rambam. Every time when he learned Gemara, he would always like to see the Psak Halacha and the Rambam. He would go to the Rambam to see how it finalizes. He had his Seder Alimut. And the Rebbe asked him for the Tanya. My father gave it to him. It could very well be that this was similar to a Tanya the Rebbe wanted to publish in 1954 with all the commentaries. I don't know, but the Rebbe was like exploring then different Tanyas. And years later, I think it was the 80s, my father came to the Rebbe and told the Rebbe that he would like to have the Tanya for a short time. He has to write it over because he didn't make copies of it. So the Rebbe said, you'll go into the library. Rabbi Levin is there, everything is organized, and you'll find the Tanya. So you go into a Lubavitch Aguch library looking for a Tanya. You have shelves and bookshelves. They found it. My father said a week. He wrote over the commentaries. So it was left with him, and he returned the Tanya to the library. So my father wrote on Chumash. My father wrote different things, if it's mefarshim or something, but he made comments, correcting things, by the margin. He would make comments. If in the Maimer there was a certain Russian Tevis which wasn't so known, he would write abbreviation of the Russian Tevis. He was studying things Pashit Le'iyun. I mean, the Maimorim that came out from the previous Rebbe, deep Maimorim in the late 40s, Kuntes Rebbe Yomtev. So I once heard from Rabbi Leibel Posner, so eingesund. He said he once asked my father, when he gets a certain inyan that's mentioned in a Maimer, when he gets a certain nerve, a certain ari something, and a very deep inyan. So he asked my father, is anything known in medicine about it? My father said no. It's like a very delicate thing. It's not like something that they can put their hands on it. But my mother have a very dakastik inyan and very delicate matters. So my father Bashir learned my mother, learned everything that came out. He learned. It was, very disciplined.
Well, describe a little bit. So he comes to America after these 5 years in Shanghai.
Wants to get a license, needs to get a license in the United States.
Right.
He has to take over all the tests.
Right.
The while he learned English and took over the tests and then got a certificate as a doctor.
Right.
And writes into the previous Rebbe, late 1949, that he is a certified physician. And the Rebbe, Friedrich Rebbe writes him a bracha. He should have atzlacha in refuah and also be mistader himself with a shidduch. Finding a soulmate.
He's already in his 30s. Right?
So it's basically late 1949, Yud Tishrei Tavshin Yud, months before Yud Shvat.
Right.
And it's interesting, in the bottom of the letter, which for whatever reason, I don't know, just my eyes didn't catch it. The previous Rebbe signs the letter, not just mevorche.
Right.
Not just mevorche, mechabdi mevorche.
Wow.
Which is a very unusual expression. Mechabdi, that he honors him, reveres him, and blesses him.
What was your yachas up to that point, the Friedrich Rebbe and your father?
When my father came to the United States, he was considered a junior doctor. And there was another doctor that was seeing the Friedrich Rebbe. And as far as I understand from people, that the Rebbe would take along my father to monitor the Friedrich Rebbe from every few days.
So that's what I wanted to ask you. Where did the Rebbe know your father from? How did that start? Okay. You're saying the publishing in Shanghai.
The publishing in Shanghai was not, he knew my father, that he brought the Svarim,
right,
but there was no
personal
real relationship. The relationship began with the previous Rebbe in 1936. My father was in Austria. The Friedrich Rebbe was there. So the Friedrich Rebbe...
He's still in medical school at this point?
1936, he's already finishing. I think he's doing research.
Okay.
and actually wrote articles and actually his findings, there were like new things that he discovered, and also working with Professor Cushing. And this is what my father told me. He went into Yechidus, and the previous Rebbe asked him, "What are you learning?" He says, "I'm learning Nigla, and I'm learning Chassidus, learning Tanya." I mean, this was something that was... So the previous Rebbe told him, the Gemara says, "Ochel v'leishasa achilas edam." A person eats and doesn't drink, it's considered blood. Why? Because it wasn't digested. Eating is Nigla. Chassidus is... drinking is Chassidus. Chassidus helps digest what he learns in Nigla.
Right.
And the Rebbe continues, you're a doctor. When you give someone a medication, you have to make sure he's able to digest it. And mainly also needs the union of drinking. So this is the Yechidus that he had in 1936, probably the first Yechidus. Next time he saw the previous Rebbe was Bepashtus in 1947.
When he came to America.
Yeah.
So where did the Yachas with the Rebbe happen?
The Rebbe was involved in everything by the Friedrich Rebbe, so he became acquainted with the Friedrich Rebbe. But I don't know where...
It's more than that, because you're saying that when he came to America, the Rebbe was the one that brought him in to be the doctor.
Right, after a time, which means this is where it began. It began that the Rebbe asked that my father should monitor the Friedrich Rebbe. How did it all start? We don't know. Where the beginning.
Your father never spoke about
how.
this?
No. How it was introduced? We don't know.
There's a yachas there that's very deep.
And it's interesting. Yeah,
there's
definitely a yachas, but not from Europe. It's mamish
not from Europe. That's what I'm asking.
Yeah, and it's interesting also because I'm already talking about before the Nisios. I think it was in the year of the Avelos and the previous Rebbe. It was then that the Rebbetzin did not feel well, the Rebbetzin Chaimushka. My father lived then...
In Tovshin Yud.
Tovshin Yud, a cold or something, there was something. And my father lived then where the Kayla later became Union of Kingston.
Upstairs.
Kenzan upstairs. He had an apartment, I don't know exactly. It seems like it was that building behind 770.
You're talking.
No, on Union Street.
Not with the Kaylas. No.
On
right
Union Street, the old Kayla location on Union Street.
Right.
The Rebbe knocked on the door Shabbos morning, and he asked if my father can come along to see the Rebbetzin. It was Shabbos morning, a certain Shabbos morning, I don't know a date. And he went along. And the Rebbe told my father when he came into the building, it was an apartment building, 346. New York, that he should be careful not to take off his scarf because there's no Eilev in the building. This is what I heard from my father.
Mm-hmm. Your father moved immediately to Crown Heights when he came to America?
No, he lived by his sister for a while. I don't know how long. Then he moved to Union Street. And actually, it was that house, Union Street, where he was called Yud Shvat morning to come to 770. The Friedrich Rebbe wasn't feeling well. And that's when he came running, I think from the backyard or from Kingston. He was still there. When he got married, he moved to Eastern Park in Schenectady.
Was he at the time the only doctor in the community?
There were other doctors, not Lubavitch, not frum even. I don't think how religious they were. There were all kinds of doctors. There were pediatricians. There were different doctors.
I mean, in those days, how many frum doctors were there? Probably not.
No, rarely. Mamish. There were some doctors that in later years, they were a little envious of my father, felt that my father is not doing conventional medicine, which actually is unfounded. It has no base to it because my father, everything was medical. And my father would attend meetings. He was affiliated with Beth Israel. And the Rebbe would send many people to my father.
It seems like your father was very ahead of his times in the sense, because I was reading, I'm not a doctor, but I was reading in the book about him that he was very into vitamins, which makes sense because he was in his stomach. But he has a whole write-up of nutrition, what you should eat and shouldn't eat, which medicine is only now beginning to pay proper attention to. Right? He understood that. And it's also interesting because, again, this is something that is it makes so much sense that, like, he's Rebbe's doctor, because it's all about, your health in a specific part of your body is dependent on your overall health. And then your overall health is dependent on your nafshistike health. it's a very wholesome picture. And
This is
this way the Rebbe spoke.
Right. This is the letter that the Rebbe wrote to the doctors.
Right.
Then.
Right. But your father was very ahead of his times in that regard.
In fact,
people in those days, I'm sure, looked at him like a little bit like, "What are you talking about?" But,
yeah. Right. People did not understand my father. Like the way he was thinking was like he was ahead. In fact, we're talking about vitamins. Frida Vitamins opened up then also in the 40s. And he was their consultant.
Ah, really?
Mamish, Dr. Zimmerman once told me, he says he was their consultant.
Right.
And after he was nifter, he wrote an article about...
I mean, he understood about vitamins in a very deep way because in China, a lot of the sickness was because of the lack of vitamins, right? He cured people with vitamins.
In fact, he walked miles to bring a vitamin to a child.
Wow.
It was like the Mesiras Nefesh with
in
torn
Shanghai.
shoes.
In Shanghai.
Yeah. I heard it from people in Shanghai. The Pashit walked miles to... And
he understood that a vitamin Pashit could save this child.
A lifeline.
Wow.
Yeah. He said that, and they didn't have what to pay.
Right.
The joint, whatever they gave, whatever. But he knew everything. He would give vitamins. He would... there was one time he was running in the street and somebody's telling him, Dr. Zelix, where are you running? The humidity was terrible in Shanghai.
Right, yes.
Pashit, the clothing, they said go clothing with Pashit right away. It was, so they asked him, where are you running? It's the middle of the day.
The summer's terrible.
Yeah, he says, somebody's sick. He has to run.
Right.
He would vitamins or other things. He had his ideas, how to help people. For example, when they had the beriberi or different diseases, whatever they had, typhus, whatever. So there was they needed to have a lot of yeast, and then maybe they had to have liver and yeast, whatever. Instead of liver, they didn't have a liver, they had peanuts.
By liver, you mean like when people eat the chicken liver?
Yeah, chicken liver, meat or beef liver. And so they had peanuts.
Right.
Peanut, that was like a secondary choice. Upon him, somebody tells me from Montreal, he says, we ate so many peanuts, the next 40 years we didn't want to look at peanuts. But that's basically, it was the supplement, I think it was vitamin B or whatever it was, but he mamish looked out for them for everything, and he was in touch with everything. And he came up with original ideas. Like, for example, after the war, he met up with American doctors with a boat. They came out from Shanghai after the war, and they said, what's happening in the United States? And they said, we came up with this thing in medicine. And they found out that he, on his own, was already forming it. He was already original.
Amazing.
So he was a tefach higher.
Oh.
And people didn't know. People are tefach higher from the ground, and people didn't realize. People who knew him, Pashit, like they say, Pashit the harotza, the respect, the revere. He was not. They say, as one person once mentioned from the Bachrim, it says 1 in a million. He says, it doesn't even know, he says, Pashit, everything, Atamat Chacham, and this, how he was careful, how he spoke, how everything by him was like disciplined, betachlis.
Was he absent-minded? Because a lot of times people that are tefach forgets his socks, forgets his socks at home.
No, he was a mesudar. Cleanliness, clean, everything spotless, everything was by him. People told me when he would come into the shul, Rabbi Reiner's shul, in Rabbi Ramaila's shul, in Vilna, the way he was dressed, the way he walked, it was every time he was always very, very on top of everything. In everything, he was mesudar betachlis.
What did people relate to him differently in when he was younger and he didn't have a beard? Was that something that people that made people misunderstand him?
There was no.
Or in those days, it meant something else?
In those days, and that generation, a lot of Lubavitcher understood different and looked at it different than they look later.
Uh-huh.
So B'meila, they knew a doctor, they knew as a frum person, they knew who he is, Talmud Chacham et al. So they knew he's not wearing a beard. There must be a reason for that. And Lepel Mamish, the Rebbe never mentioned him a word about a beard.
Mamish.
Nothing. In 1963...
And in those days, a lot of times people, for chasna, was a t'nai or something, right?
Okay, so I'm getting to that.
Okay.
So actually, just to get to 1963, my mother asked after Svira, maybe you can let the beard grow.
Your mother wanted him to have a beard?
Yeah.
Fas epis?
She said Hadras Panim, whatever I don't know what was mine, but it was her. Usually today, not always you see that happening.
Interesting. And she didn't come from a Lubavitcher family, right?
She came from a Rabbanische family, not Lubavitch.
Right.
My Zayda learned in Radin by the Chofetz Chaim.
I'm sure not all her relatives had beards either.
Yeah, not all of them had. My Zayda had. He was a Rav in a shul in Chicago later years.
Yeah, a full beard.
Yeah, he had a beard. In the pictures we see a beard. And but what happened by the Chasana was interesting because I did not know it when I published the book. The Rebbe wanted to go to the Chasana. This is late 1951, Chanukah Yud Beis. The Rebbe wanted to go to the wedding, but he wanted a heter. So he went over to Rabbi Shmuel Levitin.
Saying Chanukah Yud Beis, why couldn't he go?
December 51. Not because of Velos, because of the beard. He made a condition that a chassan has to have a beard. So here it was a little issue for the Rebbe.
How can you break a tonight? You're saying.
Yeah, break it. So he went over to Rabbi Shmuel, and he told Rabbi Shmuel that, what's...
Shmuel
Levitin.
He was Kilo Rav here?
He was the Rav, yeah.
He was
senior
the Rav
by many, I don't know if community Rav, but the Rebbe turned to him a lot.
This is before Rabbi Dvorkin?
Yeah. Rabbi Dvorkin started in the 70s, maybe earlier, till then it was Rabbi Yisrael Jacobson. So, but he was a Rabbi Shmuel, the Rebbe sold the chametz to.
He was a Rav.
And anytime there was something offhand, the Rebbe would ask him on the spot. So he was the Rav in a certain sense. I don't know if community people came to him as a Rav, but there's a Rav. Then Rabbi Zalman Shimon came from Pittsburgh, it was there. So Rabbi Shmuel told the Rebbe, this case is different. This person is different. Number one, he's not a bacher from yeshiva that you made a condition with.
Right.
Number two, he's related.
He's related to the Rebbe.
The Rebbe.
Through that.
Right.
Yeah.
B'meila, the Rebbe went to the wedding. Kabbalas Panim began 10 at night. Chanukah wedding, 10 at night.
Because you're waiting for the Rebbe?
Because waiting for the Rebbe, and the Rebbe was doing Chanukah Gelt, 8 o'clock in 770.
As the Rebbe said, if you want me to
come. The first surprise. I don't know what he said to my father. I never heard that. And actually, it's interesting because my father was waiting and waiting, which means he knew the Rebbe was going to come. So it could be that in the daytime, the Rebbe sent a message to my father that he's coming.
The guests didn't know it was going to be at 10
o'clock. The guests didn't know.
So they came to the chuppah at 5 o'clock.
Whatever. In those years, they didn't have a date like later. Yudaleh, the Rebbe mentioned that invitation should be like by the previous Rebbe at 5 o'clock.
But I'm saying
they came. Chanukah is
6 o'clock.
6, 7 o'clock.
And they waited 3 hours for the chuppah.
For the chuppah, for the Kabbalas
Panim. All right, the pictures at the Kabbalas
Panim.
Right.
And Rabbi Shaul Gordon drove the Rebbe with the Ziknei Achsidim. 10 o'clock he announces.
In Manhattan.
Yeah. It was like a lower Manhattan. And 10 o'clock he announces the Rebbe is here. The Rebbe came in, sat down by the Kabbalas Panim, and my father wanted to give the Rebbe l'chaim. So the Rebbe said, Chosin deime lemelech, similar to a king, he shouldn't be catering. So the Rebbe sat at the...
1 second, the Rebbe didn't usually fast when he was Masada Kedushin? Or...
No, that's... by Masada Kedushin I never heard it.
Okay, so I misheard.
Yeah. That would be something interesting, I never heard it. And it was already...
It's too late anyway, yeah.
So the Rebbe, so somebody poured in, you see in the picture, there's a Kerlishkul, the Rebbe, then the Rebbe started to speak the Sikha.
You said a Sikha?
Sikha. The Sikha was basically about women, foundation of the Jewish nation, and it's connected with Chanukah, the nest, the miracle that happened with them. And then the Rebbe remained sitting in the Kabbalas Panim table till after Badekanish. The Rebbe did not go to Badekanish. Once they're ready for the chuppah, the Rebbe would go directly to the chuppah.
Was this the only chasna that the Rebbe was Masada Kedushin outside of?
There were a few.
Outside of Crown
Heights?
There's
a few mentioned in Mekadesh Yisrael. There's a few of them that were outside of Crown Heights, but not too many. And then there was a Rav then that asked a question, but it's an inyan for itself. And then they went to the chuppah. The chuppah was inside, and it seems like the Rebbe knew that they're going to open up, an opening like they do today. The Rebbe looked up, nodded with the head, and he was Masada Kedushin.
Right.
At the end, the last bracha, the Rebbe wanted to honor my Zayda, my mother's father, who was a Rav, and he, in return, gave it back to the Rebbe. And
So the Rebbe said all seven
all
brachas.
7 brachas. And then the Rebbe left, came back 770, about 12 at night. In the end of his Tanya, onion skin, carbon copy original, the Sikha from the Rebbe. In other words, what my father has in the end of the Tanya, he found the Rabbi Michoel Seligson, who chossid the Sikha, he was there at that Sikha, he typed it up and he handed it to my father. So my father always kept it in the back of the Tanya, like glued in. And in 1990, when I was publishing my father's Sefer, I sent in the Sikha.
They didn't have the Sikha before.
The Sikha was there, but I'm sending it in for the Sefer.
Right.
The Rebbe was Magia it, very light, edited it, and today it is in Likutei Sichas, volume 30.
Oh, you sent it into the Rebbe with the
Sikha itself.
The Sikha itself, to include it in your Sefer, and there was.
That says before the Sefer was published, I sent it in before.
And
I think somebody mentioned it to me.
You asked her to
and then the Rebbe, I think I wrote that I'm publishing it in the Sefer, and the Rebbe edited very light, a few light comments, and it was published in the Likutei Sichas Chelik Lamed.
The Rebbe also came to your father's Levaya, no?
The Rebbe came to my father's Levaya. It was in 1989, Tavshim Mem Tes. The Rebbe was already in the house. It was the year after Chav Beis Shvat of the Rebbetzin.
Right.
I was notified the Rebbe's coming. It was 12:30, and right in front of our car, the Rebbe was just coming to 770. Came out to the Levaya, went back to his room, and then went back home.
So he came especially for the Levaya.
Yeah, there was this is in addition to the fact that the Rebbe Bechlal did not go out to too many Levayas after 1978, Lamed Ches. It's about 16 or 20, whatever it is. Here, the Rebbe came from the house special and went back.
That's very interesting what you mentioned earlier, that the Rebbe never mentioned the beer to your father. I guess he trusted him that whenever he decides, he decides.
He knew that, whatever he decides. I never heard that the Rebbe should mention anything. Because if the Rebbe would have mentioned, my father would have already won a beer before. So it seems like it started from my mother.
Fascinating.
There are certain people, for example, another email. My mother is a daughter of a Kayan.
Right.
The husband of a daughter of a Kayan needs to learn, like a mother needs to know. And the Rebbe would write it to everyone. A bracha and askama for shidduch. The Rebbe would say to be well versed, not in the words, but well versed in the masechta, in a small masechta. Whatever. What I heard was that my father asked the Rebbe Benigiyat himself, and the Rebbe says, "Don't worry, you don't need to."
Rebbe said there.
Yeah. The Rebbe he would speak with the Rebbe in learning in the early years, before I think the Nesias, maybe Nesias. I heard it from one person that they heard it from their father. Stand by the door and speak with the Rebbe in learning different things.
With the medicine and
the medicine, and also in learning, Nigla, Rein and Nigla. He would come every Thursday night. This I heard from a relative of yours. Come every Thursday night in the Cheder Sheni, in the library there, while they were in yeshiva, and he would just look up different svarim. He would be there for a few hours. And they later told him, you don't have to put the svarim back. They said you can leave it on. But he was supposed to look up halacha things, contemporary svarim, everything. He was connected with Rabbi Moshe Feinstein. He had any questions, he would call up, and they would give over the answer to him.
Fascinating. And what was also so interesting, although at this point, if you're listening to this point, it will make a lot of sense to you, and you would never imagine it any other way, is that your father never had a clinic like an office. He saw his patients. You said it was like a part of your apartment at the time.
It's a big apartment, Baruch Hashem, and he managed
in 706.
Yes, on 706 it was bigger than the older one, so that was mamish. He saw patients there, and that's how he managed.
I'm saying he never built up an office or a geschäft.
There is a separate inyan. But it's a separate inyan that there were certain inyanim that the Rebbe spoke to him about different things, but he didn't. There's certain things that. So one of the things is, that he did. He was matzliach. That when it came to 706, which was very helpful because people would come. 770, they'll be able to come right to the house instead of hours and mices. My father, there was no hours, no day, no night.
Yeah, you were saying before he was up 21
and,
hours a day.
Come,
yeah, let's talk a little about the Himmeldiker Mises. I mean, we would be remiss if we didn't speak a little bit about the Himmeldiker Mises with your father and the Rebbe. There were a number of instances where I mean, I don't understand these stories. Maybe you have a better understanding of these stories, but the Rebbe would give like a bracha, but like ki'ilu b'derech hateva, by having your father be maskim. Describe with these stories of as that garnished,
It was basically that my father was the tziner or the sar, whatever it was, connected with refuah, and he wanted my father to pass the psak.
Right.
And that was the mahalach of the different stories. I mean, there were a few stories that attest to it. There are many more that probably people never shared. But
so share a story.
A few stories which I heard and which were published. This is the ones that I know. Are one of the stories was with a chossid, Rabbi Zalman Gerari, who wasn't well. It was a Shabbos Shmini Atzeres. It seems to be in the late 50s. And his daughter, Mrs. Sternberg, she went to the Rebbe's house and asked what to do. The Rebbe answered the door. The Rebbe gave over the message to turn to my father, turn to Dr. Seligson. She went out of the house. She reminded herself they already called another doctor. So they didn't know what to do now. So she went back to the house, and the Rebbetzin answered, and the Rebbetzin Bechlal, her nature was, she does not interpret anything. She just relays the message as is. So she again went to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe said, if they went to another doctor, let them be with the other doctor. When she came home, her father asked her, tell me exactly what happened. So she said, originally, the first resort, the Rebbe said, Dr. Zelix. He says, if so, we're calling him. They called my father, and as mentioned, it was Shabbos and Yom Tov. My father was also a halacha mensch. The Rebbe once said about him, he's baki in halacha, and you can also ask him halacha. And my father says, since it's Shabbos and Yom Tov, it's not a pikuach nefesh, it's not a life-threatening issue. Let's wait till after Shabbos. It was actually a kidney stone, high fever, whatever it was. It was a result of the kidney stone. Lepeyel, what I heard a few years ago is that one of the family members told the Rebbe that what my father said. So the Rebbe said, uns ken gar sein, that we don't even have to wait till after Shabbos because it'll pass on its own. And that's exactly what happened. Mitzvah Shabbos, he had relief, the stone passed, unfertig, and sie waren menuchadik. That night was the Fabringen right before Hakofes. Midnight Hakofes, before that there was a Fabringen. In the middle of the Fabringen, the Rebbe gave l'chaim or mezenes to the son, who was a mashpia today in Montreal, Rabbi Chamer, and then he saw my father. And this is a story that I heard from my father, because he heard me talk about it, so he described to me. He was coming from a few patients then. In Yom Tov, he had instruments in his pocket. And he, Bechlal, wasn't a jumper that can jump over tables. And there was a table between him and the Rebbe, more than a table. And the Rebbe saw he was standing there. The Rebbe stood up. The Rebbe took some of the wine, his wine, and mezenes, cake. And the Rebbe, told my father, Keanim echlim vailim eskaprim. The Kean will eat. The sacrifices and the owners are forgiven. And you will eat, the patient will get well. And then the Rebbe said a word, which is two versions I have to it. One is that when there is a certain issue and doctors hold one thing and I hold different, you should hold with me. And Mamela, I will have a doctor that holds with me.
He said at that
Yeah, Payas and Chasdira then. Another version that I heard from Rabbi Zalman Lipsker, who was in Philadelphia, that the Rebbe said the Lashon, when there's a certain issue and I will send to you, you will know what to say. So it's on the same line, but not with doctors, but basically the case itself, the person himself, the patient himself. This, and in addition to that, probably other guidelines that my father received from the Rebbe, that is that he knew when the Rebbe sent a patient to him. As I'll mention a story about a certain person who had a heart condition, and they wrote to the Rebbe. The Rebbe sent them to a referral. Somebody who can give them a referral was Dr. Twersky, Rabbi Dr. Twersky. I think they live in Borough Park. He gave them a referral, a cardiologist, and he told the cardiologist, who already retired, but he was willing to see her, says, I don't give more than a half a year if there's no surgery. They need surgery immediately. She did not want surgery. They wrote into the Rebbe again. The Rebbe told her, Dr. Zelixson, they come to my father, and they were my father's patients. My father says, what did the Rebbe say? Rofeh, yedid, or he mentioned my name? So he said, they mentioned your name. So my father said, right there and then, there's no need for surgery. He had to do what the Rebbe wanted from him.
So he knew right away.
He knew right away the code. This was a code that he knew from the Rebbe. They felt very traumatized. The cardiologist, Mamish, really traumatized them. And it was very scary. What to do? They asked my father, maybe you can talk to the cardiologist, listen what he says, maybe you hear another point. Father says, I have really nothing to say to him, not interested, but since he saw that they were shaken up, he decided he'll do it. He went on the phone. After 10 minutes discussing the whole thing, my father went off the phone and he said in Yiddish, halt seins und ich halt meins. He holds his and I hold mine. There's no need for surgery. They wrote him to the Rebbe. My father says, the Rebbe gave a bracha. She lived another 18 years. This is a ma'aseh that the family published the article in the Kvar Chabad on their own. And B'meila, this is from the family itself.
How do you understand that? Because your father was a very practical, like you said earlier, medical person, and here he pushed it. Did he see it differently, or he said, look, obviously the Rebbe wants me to pass in difference.
Exactly.
What was going on there?
It seems like the Rebbe had a certain code that he saw the Rebbe quite often. In the early years, he would go into the Rebbe every Friday night. After davening, he would sit by the Rebbe for quite a while.
To check on the Rebbe?
Not check on the Rebbe. The Rebbe had conversations with him. Nobody knows what. I heard it in the middle of the Shiva.
Every Friday night?
Every Friday night in 70 years ago and later also, but slower, not maybe as often, but it happened. Friday night was a time that he would go on, even in the 60s, he would go for 20 minutes. He would discuss patience.
But after davening?
It seems like after Kabbalah Shabbos, yeah. After Ma'ariv.
Every week he would go to the Rebbe to talk?
In the Rebbe's room, he would go in and he would spend time there. Mm-hmm. We never knew anything. We had no idea what. But in the Shiva of my father, I heard it from two people that remembered it.
That what? Oh, you didn't even know that he would go in?
No. We knew in the 60s that he went in, but that person told me that it was actually from 1954 began, winter time. Mm-hmm. That's when they remembered as Bacharim. The Rebbe would ask him about medicine. There was one time the Rebbe gave him a letter. You should check out to see if there's something new in medicine about a certain ailment. And the same thing is also with the story I was beginning to tell you about in the hallway from the Rebbe. That when he went out once, the Rebbe, and he showed my father a telegram. And he asked my father, is there any solution, any remedy for that? So my father said, as far as he knows, there's nothing new in the world. Nothing new. The Rebbe went back to his room. He came back a while later. My father understood the Rebbe wanted. Either the Rebbe told him or he himself already started to think maybe this and this inyan could do. And that's what the Rebbe wanted to hear. Something, a channel. So this was the story with this Maisa, with this heart patient. There was another story that
Well, just 1 second. So the Rebbe came out with this.
Came out again, and my father says
it's an X-ray.
A telegram it was.
Telegram.
And my father says, yes, we can possibly this. I am not sure, but I think the Rebbe smiled, and that's it. That's what he wanted. That's what he needed then.
There were also mices where the Rebbe would ask him to see if he saw something in a scan, no?
Yeah, so that's the second story, is that the Rebbe sends someone, a shliach, there's a head shliach then from Argentina, that the Rebbe, Rabbi Baumgarten Abba Seligson, that it was in the late 60s or early 70s, that he was diagnosed with something serious. And he came to New York to take the tests. He took his whole folder and brought it into the Rebbe in Yechidus. The Rebbe told him, what are you coming to me? Go into Dr. Zelix. He went to my father. And he's telling my father the background, and my father tells him, show me the x-rays. He shows my father the x-rays. And my father says, where? He says, right here. My father says, I don't see anything. So he says, right here. Father says, I don't see anything. He saw, it's not on the same channel. He went back to the Rebbe, and the Rebbe asked him, was hat der Doktor gesagt? Dr. Zelix sagt, hat gar nicht gesehen. So the Rebbe says, let me Miraculous geben, let me give a look. And the Rebbe says, und ich sehe echt gar nicht. I also don't see anything. And the person was completely cured.
Mamish.
Had gelebt.
Well, he passed away later from something else.
Yeah, from a different sibah. And the third story was, which also tells you what connection my father had with the Rebbe. It was Simchas Torah evening, the night going to Simchas Torah. So between the Fabringen and Hakofes, 770 was topsy-turvy. Benches, tables, everything was in the air. And a bacher somehow, a 12, 13-year-old bacher, collapsed, fainted, passed out. And it was hard to revive him. His father came, took him upstairs. There was a couch there in an office. And he's running to Rabbi Chodakov. It's an emergency. Rabbi Chodakov says, the Rebbe is not available now. He's preparing for Hakofes. Rabbi Chodakov himself did go in. Rabbi Chodakov gave over to the Rebbe what was happening. So the Rebbe says they should call my father, Dr. Zelixson. He asked Rabbi Chodakov, the father asked Rabbi Chodakov, where am I going to find him now? It's like a needle in a haystack. It's everybody's there, thousands of people. So he says, you'll find him. Happens to be, my father came in from upstairs shul, which is quiet, completely quiet, because everything is downstairs, empty. He asks my father immediately to see the child. He sees the child. My father says, everything will be all right. And then he says, I need to talk to the Rebbe. Came out from the Rebbe. He had an open door by the Rebbe. He came out, he told the father of the child, from whom I heard it a few times. This is Rabbi Raskin from Morocco. That the Rebbe once told my father that when you come to a situation where medicine cannot do anything, you should pass a verdict, a psak, that everything is in order, and I will do the rest, the Rebbe said. Child woke up a few minutes later. The Rebbe waited till he's ready to go down to Hakofes, and that's when the Rebbe came into Hakofes.
So your father told Rabbi Raskin this after he went to the Rebbe. He said that.
Yeah, so it's
not in the name of the Rebbe, but he was saying.
He said that the Rebbe told him in the past.
Right.
That's why he's explaining why he went in first to see the child, and then he went to the Rebbe, because he saw this is something that's more serious.
How did your father see the Rebbe? Did he ever describe the Rebbe to you? He obviously had a very unique relationship with him.
There's a very deep connection. My father Bechlal did not express things that were happening unless it was a story that related to us, as a family. I mean, for example, just a personal experience that was, I remember that day my father came and told me the story. It was 1970. I was giving a certain pilpul in yeshiva, in Lubavitch yeshiva, Ocean Parkway. And the topic was an interesting topic. Masechta Ksuvis, it was same Tosem Alecha Melech, actually this week's parsha. And usually the Rebbe gets a carbon copy of the references. The person says a pilpul, the principal gets, the speaker gets, and I think there's about 3-4 carbon copies. The Rebbe got his copy. In the morning, the next day, in the morning, the Rebbe walks over to my father. He sees him and he says, I heard he said a pilpul. How did it go? Did he mention the Tzemach Tzedek? These were like the questions the Rebbe asked. So there was something. My father brought home a certain interesting experience that he had with the Rebbe. Another experience from the 5 stories that I can count on my hand that my father told me was a story with Rabbi Shmuel Levitin. Rabbi Shmuel Levitin wasn't well. It was in 68 or 69. And he told my father he wants to have a remedy from above. He wants to have bidei shamayim. Not a medication, but something that comes in a very soft, mild way, no side effects, and an immediate relief. And he told my father that there is a commentary that says there's a difference of healing. Rifo'enu is soft, verape yerape is hard. In other words, from a doctor, physical doctor, it's uncomfortable. There's side effects. It takes time. But rifo'enu, a soft healing, is from Hashem. He asks my father, please relate to the Rebbe this message. Father somehow came to the Rebbe, and he told the Rebbe the senior. This is the middle of the week. The Rebbe took a bichel of chassidus, a written chassidus, a written book of chassidus, which later proved to be my modem of the Tzemach Tzedek, and was looking for something, browsing back and forth. My father felt uncomfortable, hanging out there, just waiting, and the Rebbe did not say anything, so he just walked out of the room. He gave the shlichus. My father's very proper. A few minutes later, the secretary calls him in. My father begins reading from a maimer of the Tzemach Tzedek.
Your father or the Rebbe?
I'm sorry, the Rebbe begins reading from a maimer of the Tzemach Tzedek, from a written maimer, Rifo'eni Hashem ve'irofeh, in Yirmiyah. And that is where the Tzemach Tzedek mentions this Rabbeinu Bechai, the difference between a soft and a more difficult curing.
No, but my question is, did your father speak of there's a way that Chassidim speak of the Rebbe with there's a certain language, a certain way.
He didn't like analyze or be mitayed or magdir. He wasn't like that person. He was quiet. He just said, Farbrengens are very important. It's in the name of Yerushalayim, every Farbrengen, and it's something which Mamish contributes to Chassidim and to everybody that Farbrengen.
That's how he was Magdir Farbrengen in Yonim of Yerushalayim.
That's one of the things is Yerushalayim. I think he mentioned also another thing, but I don't remember. But I mean, it was once...
That's fascinating. Who was Magdir Farbrengen in Yonim of Yerushalayim?
I know, but by him he was also with the Weltische Welt.
Right.
So he sees that also.
Right.
So by him Bechalal, the union of Yerushalayim, he was, but it was Chassidus, my Morim, I mean by him everything was, it all went. It wasn't like he was, sifting out. He would sit by Farbrengen hours. I mean, there was one time that he sat by Farbrengen later than usual, although he needed to go home already. And the Rebbe says, why was he later than always? And he said, my son kept me because we walked home together and the neighborhood was changing then. So I told my father, I want to stay yet. I'm staying. So he stayed till after the Farbrengen. So late Farbrengen.
You would stand next to him?
No. My father, Bechlal, would stand by Farbrengen.
Stand by Farbrengen?
Yes. This is one thing that people don't realize. Younger light would be comfortable sitting, some young man. My father stood by Farbrengen all the years, besides the older years, Mamish, when he was told, when he was given the option, or they asked him to go up on the bimah to sit. So that's when he sat behind the Rebbe, to the side. Mm-hmm. There's pictures. But till then, he would stand quietly. He would come, and between the bleachers and the first line of people, he would stand on the floor. He would come there from his house, from the Suda, come in 22 like a few minutes after the beginning. and he would just stand there quietly and listen. He appreciated very much Chazorah Farbrengen.
He would sit by Chazara.
Not by Chazorah. He appreciated that I Chazor the Farbrengens.
You were one of the Chazrim.
Not formally by Chazorah, but I would write down my own Hanocha Pratis, and he, Mamish, would always encourage it. This is something that encouraged very much Chazing the Farbrengen and to write it. But the Chazorah, I would Chazor for him, and later, when I started to contribute and send my copy to, the ones who are putting together the sichas. But it was a freelance inyan which I did privately. But my father was the one that really encouraged me. Chazor Iber, give over, what did the Rebbe say today? It was an interesting way, which was also a discipline.
But it's also interesting. He wouldn't always stay to the end.
The late night Farbrengens, either because the Shechuna was changing and we were walking to Schenectady, so he himself did not walk home alone, but he waited for a companion. Who was the big Yiber? Was his son. His son is the second, my brother. So
you have a brother.
You have a brother, younger brother, Yosef Yitzchak. So basically...
He lives here too?
He lives here, yeah, in 706. So my father would wait, one sich another. I mean, it wasn't, and then later he would sit behind the Rebbes. He would sit till the end of the Farbrengen.
Fascinating.
But doctors don't understand. The doctors who saw my father as attending to him in later years, they had no idea how he existed. 3 hours a night sleeping. By 40s, he had a stroke, and he's completely like full force, everything. Yeah, he knew nature. People would come to him. I need energy. What do I do for energy? Take grapes, a piece of chocolate, grapefruit, and these were pashat till Ad Hayim, till this very day. These are things that people are pashat religiously following. It's pashat. He knew nature, and he pashat would, instead of medication, he was into nutrition. And we're talking about he was ahead of his time.
Yes, very
ahead of his time. In the 1980s, he wrote about the nutrition.
Yeah.
And that's when they're starting later to start looking at it. So he was always thinking. And he always, coming up with things. He was original.
Yeah. It certainly sounds like a very original yid. And it just the whole thing is fascinating. Where on one hand he is very close to a space of Maifsim and the Mailim and Ateva, right? Like you were talking about earlier. But at the same time, it sounds like he was a very down to earth person who was not. He took things very seriously. Like taking the vitamin to the child is the ultimate taking serious. It's not ma'ifsin, that's fakert. It's understanding that something.
Shoes walking in there for a vitamin of a child. Right. There was another story I wanted to mention. When you get a lady in Shanghai who's going to go through a certain surgery which would not allow her to have children, and because they told her she can't have children, my father says, wait till the United States. Baruch Hashem, she had a whole family of children. She says it's thanks to him that he spared her. He was a friend. He was a very close friend, a dear friend to people.
So what would you say? The only concern I have of this whole conversation for people listening is that you hear a story of the story of your father. Almost the more you hear about him, the more distant and impossible, it's too out of reach for most people. What would you say is the Musar Haskell, the secret that your father
Musar
has to share to people?
Basically is in the physical sense, as a doctor, he was always available in saving people. He was a very committed, very dedicated, and he had to do what he needed to do. People say, well, how do you know it'll work? He ran on anything. Any emergency, Shabbos, Yom Tov, we got calls in the house, he ran out and to save lives. His thing was basically to save lives. And that's on what his whole profession is based on. In addition to that, because of his talent, because of his capabilities and his faculties, he was it was like off the ground. I mean, he was able to reach higher, and he would actually use it. The Rebbe once said about him that with his nefesh hativis, with medicine, he refined his nefesh hativis.
Wow.
Nefesh hativis. And something else, with halacha, he refined his nefesh. There were two expressions that the Rebbe once said by Fabrengen. In other words, he put himself into it altogether. His whole life was into it. When he was there, he was there. When he was learning. Everything by him had its slot.
A pnimi.
Yeah, mamish pnimi, atzlach in zman, in everything.
Right.
He was, and he always protected people. Never mentioned names, nothing. He'd bring examples from cases, but never mentioned name. He mentioned a story he had in Shanghai. A story that happened in Krakow. It's a story that he diagnosed. He did research on a certain case which was connected, I think, with Professor Cushing, and he knew the case. And there was a certain patient who had symptoms, and they were all getting together. I don't even know what's passed out in the minyan. And they asked my father should make a statement, and my father said exactly, diagnosed it with all these symptoms. It's this and this, and they had all the professors, all the doctors. The doctors, some who were not so fond of him because he was a yid, so they said, it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't hold water. The professors remained silent. A few days later, the professors confirmed that he was right.
Right.
He knew a diagnosis. He had his instruments, the basic instruments, but you had a professor in a pulmonary, in the lungs. The professor once said to about my father, he said, he knows more than I know with my instruments. This is an expert on lungs. Because my father explained to him exactly what was the problem, and there was no problem there. The father told him, there's no issue there. He thought there was an issue. And the Rebbe also felt there was no issue. But the Rebbe said, let her keep going. Lepeo, they got on the phone, and my father tried to explain to him what exactly it is. So he was a doctor that really thoroughly knew a person. When a person came to my father, they knew his diagnosis, the final.
Look, from everything I'm hearing, I think sometimes you hear a story about a person who's take a different level, right? The idea, some people are take. The Rebbe said he's a Lamed Vavnik. No,
The whole thing is it's a different world.
By definition, it's a different world. But the lesson that I'm drawing is that your father seemed to be very, very clear about what was important, and that's what dictated his mahalach. And if I make sense of his story, it seems like he had in part this Clarkite came from the fact that he grew up in an unusual circumstance, and he had to make decisions for himself in a way. And figure out their own path, and the way he did that was by figuring out.
Right.
No?
So when he got to Yiddishkeit, he had his father, which was Mamish's guideline.
But even his father was being himself as a
right. It was all right. But they did have. I mean, my father always would mention with pride the different customs they had. They kept it up.
Right.
But in the medical world, and especially the obstacles that he had when he got to Yiddishkeit, was different than they have today.
Right.
It's like, I mean,
but
a lot of things.
Even going to Shanghai and all these.
There were decisions. He was on his own. His parents told him, "We're old. We can't run," and they told him, "You have a life ahead of you."
There's like this. What resonates with me is that he did what he thought was right. He did what he thought was right. He wasn't trying to show off or try to fit in or try to
Yeah, he did whatever was right. He stood up for it.
Right.
I mean, there was once a story with a lady who had a very bad condition. She had a child, but the child was in the tubes. It was very dangerous, and it was internal bleeding. They called an ambulance. Those times there were no Hatzalah, and this ambulance was playing around with the time, with this.
Right.
My father came right on the spot and forced him, and he says, immediately, get to the hospital. Baruch Hashem, she was saved. Her father later wrote a letter to my father. You have saved 7 lives, a mother and children. My father was no when it came to medicine. He stepped up. Although he was a quiet person, there was one thing that
But
he
it sounds
never
like it wasn't just
stopped
medicine.
at.
It's
Anything,
not,
Yiddishkeit, anything.
It sounds like everything
that,
was like
right,
this.
this whole Seder HaChaim. It was once before Farbringen, a Bocher came. He had a problem with the foot, with the leg. My father's working on him, bandaging him, whatever it was. So my father told him, he asked my father, what my father says, that's in order you should be able to stand comfortably by the Farbringen. Another time, somebody had a certain issue, so he said to my father, should I come to Farbringen? My father said, surely. Farbringen, sicher. Other things, okay, take it easy. Farbringen, it's a must. He was a Hesa chossid, but he was not a person that expressed emotions.
Right.
And people don't realize. I mean, we see from the stories how he was übergegeben and everything to the Rebbe. There's no question about it. The Rebbe would give him a matzah every year at Pesach. And the Rebbe called in the doctors who dealt with the Rebbe in 1977, Lamed Ches. My father was being briefed by Dr. Weiss, Dr. Resnick. The Rebbe wanted him to be briefed and consulted. I heard this from Dr. Weiss. Anything that was going on then, and in the earlier years, my father was dealing it with himself, and the Rebbe didn't want anybody else to be involved. So there was a lot going on, and people don't. At one point, the Rebbe even told someone, a certain case, that somebody had a facial muscle, a certain issue. The Rebbe said to go to my father. And they were my father's patients. And they're looking at the Rebbe like rose slightly and says he's one of the biggest diagnosticians we have today. So he had a hush, and like I said, everybody admitted, on the ball, on the spot. He didn't need any tests, anything, and he was always, exactly. When he told someone there's nothing to be concerned, that's it. They went by that.
There was one last story that you mentioned in the book. I don't think it has to do with your father. It's about, there was a relative of yours that, I think it was a bachelor that stayed with the Rebbe in the Rebbetzin.
His name was Rab Sendereinen. He was married to my father's first cousin.
Oh, she was married.
Yeah, he was married to my father's first cousin. There were no children there, sadly. And after his wife was nifta, the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin took him in to their house. This must have been President Street. Was
there ever such another person who stayed as a guest by the...
Only relatives.
So what was the vart there? What was the...
He had a very deep connection. He's a bracha for himself. Right. He had many kiruvim from the Rebbe Rashab. He heard many things from the Rebbe Rashab, which the Rebbe mentioned the Sikha. It was very hard to get from him. He would always walk around with his packle of notes. And he worked to get the Friedrich Rebbe out of prison through the governments, the German government, etc. And he also, actually, earlier by the Rebbe Rashab, he brought a nesrik for the Rebbe Rashab one of the years. I heard from my father, he just put it on the stender when the Rebbe Rashab was davening Yud Gimel Tishrei, Yortzeit. So he put it on the stender, the Rebbe Rashab should see it came. And there were different things, it seems like he did. He was later in the Igros Kodesh, number 15 from the previous Rebbe. You can see that he was entrusted with the bank account from the Friedrich Rebbe. He would be like in charge of the account, saving things there, or even the safe box. It was a very, very trustworthy inyan that he had. And that's when he became close with the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin. It's him and his wife. And they knew each other from Paris.
And so when his wife passed away, when was this?
1953.
1953.
Here in New York.
Right, so he went to the Rebbetzin.
He didn't ask for it.
Right.
The Rebbe and the Rebbetzin felt that one of them, and both of them agreed that he should move. That they want to take him in there. He shouldn't be on his own. He was an older person. He was actually even older than being accepted in Temchet Mimim in 1897. So he was born. It seems like he was a little older than the Friedrich Rebbe, I think.
Uh-huh.
And here he was by the Friedrich Rebbe. He had yedid, and at one point, the Rebbe asked him, "How come we don't see you? You don't visit us anymore." He used to visit, used to talk.
Where did he live?
No, he lived here in Crown Heights, but here he didn't go to the Rebbe's house.
Uh-huh.
So he said to the Rebbe, he says, "Here you are, them Rebbes Edom. Son-in-law, the Rebbe, it's a whole different...
You're saying
so it's like off limits.
Compared to Paris, you're saying?
Yeah, so in comparison to Paris. So in Paris, he once saw the Rebbe learning, the Strasheller Sefer. The Rebbe told him it's a deep Sefer. Rabbi Herson had a very close shaykhus with him because the Rebbe wanted, after he felt uncomfortable being in the Rebbe's house, the Rebbe said he can go into the apartment on the condition that there's 2 Bacharim, boarders with him. So he then moved to Bergen and Nostrand, Epes Mamish, where the Lubavitch Yeshiva was. And there were 2 Bacham, Rabbi Herson and Rabbi Emanuel Shochat, I think. They were the Bacham with him. And thanks to Rabbi Herson, so sein gesund, many stories that are published in my father's Sefer are from him.
Uh-huh.
In fact, I wrote to the Rebbe that I want to write a skirok tzora about Rab Sender. So the Rebbe crossed out tzora, skira. And there's a famous story that was published later in the Rishimes, the kiss that the previous Rebbe gave the Rebbe in the morning of Cheshvan or Kislev in late 1932, I think it was. It's in the Rishimes.
Saying with the light in the room.
Yeah, light in the room. And that was published in my father's Sefer.
Before the Rishimes.
Before the Rishimes.
You heard it from Sender.
Right. He heard it from Rab Sender, and Rab Sender must have heard it from someone in the house because he was close with the Friedrich Rebbe's family. So this was a story that later they were able to figure out in the Rishimes who the Rebbe is talking about. The Rebbe writes it half words.
You knew this Rab Sender? You know him?
He passed away in 1958. I was a few years old.
Uh-huh.
I remember somebody came for Shabbos. He used to come for Shabbos, but I don't even know if it was him. Because he passed away late 1958. I was 5 years old, whatever it was.
Yeah, that was also just so fascinating. The idea that there was this person that stayed by the Rebbe and the Rebbetzin.
The Rebbe came to be Menachem Ovel, is him for his wife.
Right.
And the Rebbe spoke a sicha. How come they didn't give him the right respect after the Ptira? There was a whole sicha from the Rebbe, Pasha Nitzavim. Something that has to be corrected.
People didn't take him seriously as a chossid.
It seems to be, as far as I understand from my father, the place where they placed him, where they put him to rest.
Uh-huh.
Also, the Levaya went through quick. They didn't go through 770 because those years the chapel.
In general, it doesn't seem like I never heard of him before. It seems like he wasn't
The chapel was not a Lubavitcher chapel, or not yedid, not frum, not so much accommodating chassidim. So maybe they said it's late, and that was it. So it could be that also was something.
But I'm saying he wasn't. It seems like he wasn't taken.
He was behind the scene. People didn't even know who he was. He looked like an old man. But my father told me if somebody said a comment about him, something, he would, he would immediately let him know who he is.
And how is he related to you again?
He's married to my father's first cousin, Rabbi Zalman Zelikson's daughter.
The one from Vilna. From Vilna. Wow.
It's interesting to note, Benigia, to my father and people knowing who's the doctor. This one's by Fabrengen. My father told me the story. He's sitting behind the Rebbe, and the Rebbe is coughing and coughing. Who's the doctor here? How does he let that happen? My father turns around to him and says, I'm the doctor. And we don't just walk in on the Rebbe. It's something that it has to be with the Rebbe's consent. Another time, I'll finish with that story. There was one time my father told me the story. There was a yid walking the street. When the Rebbe came to 770, the Rebbe told my father, this yid who's walking down the street does not look well. And check him out. My father went over to him, and he said, I'm all right. My father saw already that he was almost collapsing, and the Rebbe chapped it in time.
Anyway, this has been really, really interesting, fascinating. Thank you very much for your time. And
Slacha Rabbi.
your father's yahrzeit was about a little over a month ago.
No, Chafei Shvat.
Oh, in the book, the Akdosh is an Av, no?
The Yemaledis is off.
Okay, so the Yemaledis is
Erev
okay.
Tisha B'Av.
Akupanim is in Shamash should have an Aliyah. And,
Oh man, a yedid here. He's a practical person. He wants to be with people. He's
okay, fair enough.
Face at a mamish.
Fair enough.
He had a geschmack sitting with people, hearing things. He would chazer over a word that he heard. He had a geschmack with Moshe Rubin, with Rabbi Fuchs. All these people, they were like sharing things like peers, colleagues from Amalek Yon. It's very interesting. It's he used to light up when these people came. Yeah.
All right, it's been a pleasure to hear a word about him today. Yeah. Thank you very much. The music for this podcast comes from the album Repentant Doors by Oren Sor Nadav Bachar and is used with their permission.